Thanks very much, Siri Matti, and very good to be here again at the Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I've got a sort of problem because not only am I giving a talk this evening on the Buddha's universal teaching on Metta, I'm also giving a talk on Saturday as part of the urban retreat on, guess what, Metta. So that does kind of present a bit of a problem for me, because inevitably, how much can you say about Metta within the space of a few days? The one on the weekend will be more to do with, I think, probably the nuts and bolts, as it were, of the Metta Bhavana. Tonight I want to do something a bit different under Vedana's instructions, to do with really trying to sort of see, in a sense, why Metta is so important. Why is it so sort of crucial? Why is it so central? But if you ask that question, you have to go more deeply into the nature of the Buddha's Dharma itself. I mean, here we are in Sheffield on November the 5th, Guy Fawkes Night. We're in this moment in time in the 21st century, gathering together. But we're actually doing something that Buddhists have done since the beginning of Buddhism. Since the Buddha first started to teach the Dharma, we're actually in tune with something which flows through the whole of time, or flows through the time starting with the Buddha's actual enlightenment. Very, very early on after the Buddha's enlightenment, he gave teachings. Now, of course, I'm not saying I'm anything like the Buddha, of course not. But this whole idea of people gathering together as a community, as a sort of spiritual community of friends, to hear the Buddha's teaching expounded is a very, very long tradition. Throughout the entire Buddhist world, the Buddhist world in the East, right down now into modern times. So I think that's one of the first things we need to be aware of. We are not unique in doing this. We're part of a whole kind of stream running through history, running through time. We're not just sort of new to things. I think this is very, very important, because sometimes I think we don't, in a way, make so much effort in our Dharma life. And in a way we can also become despondent in our Dharma life, because it's a difficult life. Because we don't see ourselves, we don't see the wider picture, the wider kind of vision of things. And it's very, very important, I think, to have that wider vision of what we're involved with. When I was ordained in 1976, and a couple of years after I was ordained, I went on what we called an order convention, which was like a big gathering. Well, a big gathering of order members in those days. There were probably about 30 of us, 40 of us. That seemed like a lot of people. Sangha, our teacher and founder, led that convention. He led all the meditations, led all the pujas. He gave most of the talks. Some of us gave talks as well, but he gave the main talks. And one of the talks he gave was called A Vision of History. A Vision of History. And he started to talk about history, about the different ideas about history, just saying that, well, there's a Marxist view of history, there's this view of history, that view of history. But he came up with a rather different notion of history. He's a great student of history. And he said he had the vision of history that he presented was a history of a battle, even a war, between the spiritual community, that is, those individuals who are leading a spiritual life, a life dedicated to self-transcendence, in whatever form, but people coming together in harmony around some sort of path of individual transformation, but definitely coming together. So that's one side of the war. The other side of the war is the forces of the group, the forces of the collective, if you like, in the negative sense, the forces of people coming together basically around greed, hatred and delusion. His vision of history was of a vision of a sort of battle between these two forces. And it was very interesting the way he went into this. He started by gave us visions of the Buddhist spiritual community, saying that because the spiritual community is so central to Buddhist practice, it's one of the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma and the Sangha, and the Buddha formed a Sangha, a community. He gave us visions of the early Sangha, in particular gathering around the Buddha in complete silence sometimes, in complete harmony, sitting up all night in meditation. Even he said it's probably beyond meditation at that stage. 1,250 monks around the Buddha in absolute silence and harmony, communing, if you like, communicating on the deepest possible level. That's a kind of vision of the ultimate Sangha, united in metta, united in faith and reverence for the Buddha. He gave us visions like that. But he also talked about other spiritual communities, saying, well, it's not just, you don't just have Buddhist spiritual communities. He had a lot to say about a religion which we know very little about, known as Manichaeism. Manichaeism, which was a dualist teaching, rather like the Cathars in the Languedoc, founded by somebody called Mani, a Persian, very famous for its emphasis on the arts and beauty, and very famous for its non-violence, very famous for its vegetarianism, seeking to release what's known as the man of light from the darkness of matter into the realm of light. But we know hardly anything about it, even though it's spread all over Central Asia, spread even into China. We know very little about it because it was wiped out by a combination of Zoroastrianism and Islam, completely smashed. And he talked a bit like this about these different communities, and he was saying, you are part of a long tradition in human life, a long tradition in human life of individuals coming together, united in friendship, united in metta, in community, seeking to transform yourselves, not just through working on yourself, but helping one another to grow and develop along the path. And he said the thing is about this, it's a kind of a difficult battle, because the forces of the group, the forces that don't want to develop, the forces that want the status quo, have very different rules about warfare. They don't mind using violence. They don't mind, repressing you. You can't do that. In a Buddhist spiritual community, you cannot possibly respond in that way. You have to respond with metta. You have to respond with loving kindness. That is the Buddha's injunction. Hatred never ceases through hatred here in this world. Hatred only ceases through love. This is an eternal truth, a sanatana dharma, an eternal law, an eternal reality, an eternal order. That's the teaching of the Buddha. So he's saying you're part of this great tradition, but it's going to be a great struggle, not an easy struggle. And of course, it's not as if we are perfectly pure individuals ourselves. It's not as if all of our stream of consciousness is perfectly metaphor, perfectly loving, perfectly clear, perfectly ethical. We have our own, within us, our own forces that in a way want to dominate other people, that want to control other people, that don't like it when we ourselves are threatened. And sometimes we can feel very threatened if we take up a life of transformation. So it's not as if those group tendencies are out there, they're in here as well. And we can sometimes experience that even within the spiritual community itself. It's one of the powerful, transformative elements of the spiritual community, because sometimes, to our horror, we find ourselves in a room with somebody who says they're a Buddhist, they're interested in Buddhism, and we realise that we really don't like them. We really don't like them. In fact, we even sort of feel that we hate them. I mean, it's not that they've done anything wrong. We just don't like the look of them, don't like their clothes, maybe don't like their smell or something, I don't know. But we have that reaction But, what do you do? Do you say, there's the door? Or do you leave yourself? No, you can't do that. You have to transform it. You have to not give in to those forces of the group, which you would normally do in the world outside. So I found that vision that Sangha actually gave us very, very helpful. Very, very helpful indeed. I mean, that time the order was very small. We were a very, very young order. We're still actually a very young order. But I was a very, very young man at that time. I was in my early 20s. And sometimes you feel that, when you're practicing, Buddhist practice, because it's a very difficult thing to do, to follow the Buddhist path. And it's not an easy thing. People sometimes try to make out that it's an easy path. It's not. It's very demanding, very, very challenging. And sometimes you can get disheartened. You can feel that I can't do this. My efforts aren't good enough. But here in Sangha actually say, look, you're part of this much, much bigger stream. And you need to see yourself in that context. And you're building something together, not just for yourselves, but for others, for the future. I found that very, very helpful and very inspiring. So it's very important, I think, if we're going to talk about the Buddha's universal teaching, we need to sort of see ourselves within a kind of historical context. We are very, very primitive. Those of you who feel that you're Buddhist, we're very, very primitive Buddhists, in a sense. This is the very, very early days of the transmission of the Buddha's teaching into the West, into the modern world. Buddhism has never had to deal with the conditions that we're dealing with now. Buddhism has always operated in traditional societies. We're in a totally different environment. And we need to realise that. We need to realise that we're up against considerable forces in ourselves and in the world around us. So we need to see things in those terms. And I had a very strong experience. I was thinking just before this talk about different situations where I've communicated the Dharma. It's, like I said at the beginning, this isn't a unique occasion, gathering together here in Sheffield to talk about Buddhism, to come together in Buddhism. It's, maybe even right now in different parts of the world, this is going on. If it was India and it was a festival day, there might be teaching going on even now, and it would be getting on for about midnight in India. I've certainly given talks at midnight in India. I lived in India for many years, where we have quite a strong part of our Sangha among the Dalit, the downtrodden Buddhists, people who converted to Buddhism to liberate themselves from untouchability, from the caste system. And I lived for many years in that community doing Buddhist work, and I've certainly been up very late at night talking the Dharma. But I remember one evening when we were first in India, when we first started things, I used to regularly take a class. This was in the city of Pune, pronounced Pune these days. That's the Marathi pronunciation. I can only call it Pune for some reason. But anyway, I used to do this class in a flat that was a Buddhist family had, not far from the station. Very nice flat, lovely family, very keen on our Sangha. One of the daughters is now one of our order members. And I used to go there every week. I think it was a Monday night. I used to go and do that class. I'd lead meditation, teach the Metta Bhavana, teach the mindfulness of breathing. We'd do some Buddhist chanting in Pali. I'd give some sort of Dharma talk interpreted into Marathi. And anyway, one evening I went along. It was the 6th of December. And the 6th of December is a very important day for that community because it's the anniversary of Dr. Ambedkar's birth. Dr. Ambedkar being the great leader of that community that led them into Buddhism in 1956. And always on that day there's speeches, and gatherings and things like that. So anyway, I went along to this class. And I noticed that people were a bit later than usual. And as people started to come into the class, they looked very sad. They looked very down. They looked even a bit depressed. And as they came in and started to talk, I heard about what happened. There were speeches down by Dr. Ambedkar's statue near the railway station. And, you know, lots of Buddhists had gathered. But evidently something happened. And the police, and you have to remember that the police certainly in those days was made up of mainly caste Hindus, did what's known as a lathi charge. Lathis are very, very heavy bamboo canes. Very, very heavy, quite long, great big sticks. People were killed, men, women and children were killed. Men, women and children were badly injured. It was, you know, a catastrophe. It was supposed to be a solemn day for that community, celebrating their great leader, but it ended in tragedy, as it often did. Because back in the 70s, still that community could be on the end of some very, very rough stuff from, and it still happens now, from caste Hindus. And we sat, and I started to get questions. And the first question was, what can your Metta Bhavana do in relation to this? What can your Metta Bhavana do in relation to this? I was a very young man. In my mid-20s, no, early 20s. Hadn't been ordained very long. And I have to admit, I didn't know how to answer that question. I certainly wasn't going to give a pious lecture on, you know, returning love towards hatred and violence. I just didn't feel I could do that. I didn't feel it would be real. We just sat in silence and meditated. But I've never forgot that moment. It was a very humbling moment, and I had to go away and really think about this practice called the Metta Bhavana, the practice of developing loving kindness on all occasions to everybody, regardless of what is coming your way, regardless of what is happening to you. I'm still not sure if I was faced with a situation like that again, I'd be able to answer the question. You know, with somebody who was really distressed, or people who were really distressed by that. I'm not sure. I can't be confident that I could just come back and say, oh, well, no, if you just beam love, everything will be all right. I'm not convinced. Perhaps it's not a matter of, in that situation, of coming up with words. Maybe it's more a matter of behaviour. Maybe it's the way you are that is the really important thing in a situation like that, rather than pious platitudes. But, you know, it was a bit humiliating because, you know, I've read Buddhist texts where, you know, great masters were threatened with violence, and through the power of their love, they turned the violent bandit or whatever into a great disciple of the Buddha. I didn't do that. I couldn't do that. But nonetheless, even though that happened to me, I have a great confidence in metta, in loving kindness. It's been one of my main Buddhist practices. It's something I do more or less every day, and I've been doing it more or less every day since I was first introduced to it when I was 17. I think it's an incredibly powerful practice and a very underrated practice in the Buddhist tradition. And it's a practice that is really acting out something whereby one can tune in to the Buddha's insight into the nature of reality, into the way things really are. It's not simply a practice where you're just having nice, loving feelings. That's not really what it's about. The practice is revolutionary. It's concerned with bringing about a turning around in the deepest seat of your being, so that you act differently, you act in another kind of way. And throughout the Buddhist texts, you get this reference to loving kindness, to metta, as the way to be. The way to be. Loving kindness is the way to be under all circumstances. That, if you're living like that, you're in tune with the way things are. In some ways, it's not even explained. Why? is just sort of thought, well, it's obvious. It's obvious. You can explain it. You can go into all the philosophical whys and wherefores, and maybe we can do that. Maybe I'll have a go at that. But that is just the way it is, like that quotation that I did, which is Dhammapada verse 4. Not by hatred does hatred ever cease here in this world. It only ceases through love. This is a sanatana dharma, an eternal law. This is reality. This is the way things are. I mean, it's very, very obvious when you look at it. You only have to look at, maybe even look at your own experiences, look at the world around you, how a hateful response to hatred, a violent response to violence, perpetuates more hatred and more violence. It just goes on and on and on. And perhaps in our own experience, maybe we can look at ourselves more deeply. And have we ever solved, hatred, hatred coming at us with a hateful response? Has that ever really dealt with our problems? There can be a feeling, can't there, that if you're attacked by somebody, if you're verbally attacked, or if you feel you're verbally attacked, or you're wronged by somebody, maybe somebody who you once trusted and you thought cared for you, and they treat you in a way that is surprising, or they reject you or something like that, or they say a harsh word, I don't know. There can be a feeling, if I get them back, that will kind of make everything all right. That will restore the balance to the universe. I don't know about you, if I feel attacked, it's like there's an imbalance in the universe. There's something kind of wrong. And it can only be evened out through getting back at the other. I think this is called an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. That will somehow restore the balance. And of course it doesn't. It just distorts things more and more and more. What the Buddhists would say in that context, no, the way you restore the situation is through dissolving that sense of being wounded, dissolving in a way that very, very strong sense of a separate self that you have in that moment. Because that's what happens, certainly what happens to me when I feel under attack from somebody, or I've been wronged by somebody. I have a very, very strong sense of myself as separated out from others. Not just that person, actually it affects all my relationships. You can sort of see it sometimes very strongly with somebody eaten up with resentment or bitterness. They're sort of separated out from everybody. It's not just the person that may be, or the people that have wronged them, it's actually everybody, because it becomes a kind of topic that affects all their relationships. So they're separated out. If you're separated out from others, you're separated out from life. And if you're separated out from others and you're separated out from life, you are not in touch with the way things are. You're not in touch with reality. I mean, the Buddha's vision of reality is actually that there is really no separation, ultimately, between ourselves and others and ourselves and life. That is a sort of a kind of idea that we've got. It's a very deeply held idea, reinforced with greed, hatred and delusion. It's not something that you can just click your fingers and have a reframe about. It's very, very deeply seated in the depths of consciousness. But in reality, actually, there is really a flow between self and other, between ourselves and life. And Metta Bhavana is a way of actually coming into relationship, if you like, to that flow, experiencing that flow between self and other. In the Metta Bhavana, you soften. Yourself softens. I don't know if you've noticed this. You can sort of experience it perhaps most vividly with the friend, in that second stage. And it's very, very easy to feel that with a friend, it's kind of natural that when you hold them in consciousness, they're kind of not different from you. It's not that you're all mixed up into a sort of soup. It's not like that. I mean, they're distinct, you're distinct, they're unique, you're unique. But there's this lovely sense of sort of flow between you. You're not separated out. It becomes harder in the other stages with the person you're indifferent to, and harder to the person that you have ill will to. But sometimes you can notice a softening, even with that person who you dislike or dislikes you. Suddenly you kind of let go of that rigidity over time, and suddenly there's a kind of understanding. It's not just a feeling, there's an understanding, if you like, of the nature of that person. You've softened in relation to them. I mean, there is a kind of magic that goes on with the Metta Bhavana as well. I've certainly experienced this. I'm going into a meeting with somebody who I have a lot of difficulties from. They press my buttons, or I allow them to press my buttons, and I certainly, what their buttons are. Very uncreative situation. I do the Metta Bhavana beforehand. Strangely enough, by a strange magic, that doesn't happen. There's a softening, there's an understanding, there's a removal of that barrier between self and other. These experiences, they're not just nice, they're not just good, they're not just sort of helpful. They're actually bringing us closer to the nature of reality, the nature of things as they really are. So this is why metta is such an important practice. It leads us to a closer penetration of reality, of the way things are. And it runs through the Buddha's teaching, this idea that metta is the way to be, loving kindness is the way to be. It runs through his teaching to his monk disciples, to his lay disciples, but you also find it even in texts which are about the Buddha before his enlightenment. This is really interesting. There's a whole genre of literature in Buddhist tradition which, in the East, in the Buddhist East, all over the Buddhist East, wherever you care to go, has more effect than any other Buddhist literature, and it's barely looked at in the West. These are known as the Jatakas, the birth stories. They're really neglected in the West. And the Jatakas are all sorts of tales which are purportedly all about the Buddha's previous lives. Forget for the idea of, if there's rebirth or not rebirth. Let's not go there. That's the Buddhist tradition. So there it is. So this idea is that before the life in which the Buddha became the Buddha, before he gained enlightenment, in his time before that, he was, even though he didn't have a Buddhist practice, he was a sort of outstanding human being with a kind of community around him. He always seemed to have friends, but he was always at the sort of cutting edge of things. And all of these stories are describing all sorts of human situations, human dilemmas. And he's known as the Bodhisattva, or the Bodhisattva in these birth stories. And what you see him doing is having the best human response to the situation in which he finds himself. And this is really important because these stories, the Jataka stories, are one of the main teaching tools in the Buddhist East. One of the main teaching tools, because they're talking about the human response. The human response, if you like, for ordinary people and their lives, all the different dilemmas that they have in their lives. This is the human response, the ethical response, the right response. So one of these stories is known as the Kinari Jataka. The Kinari Jataka. And it's quite a tale, the Kinari Jataka. And it starts off with a king. I think his name's Suchandrima. I think that's his name. And this king, he's a proper follower of the Brahminical religion. And he wants to have a big sacrifice. And that means a sacrifice of living beings. This is, because he thinks that's the way to heaven. So he decides he's going to gather every single kind of living being he can get for the sacrifice, because in this way he'll build up merit. This is the right way to build up a very, very positive momentum so that he'll be reborn in heaven, in the next world. So There's elephants and horses and goats and sheep, humans, all sorts are gathered. But there's one being that he really wants to be offered, and that's a kinari. Now, a kinari is a mythical creature in Indian mythology, but you have to understand people would believe this creature would really exist. A kinari, how do you describe a kinari? Elf maiden would be one translation. An elf maiden, kind of, sometimes it's said that the kinari is sort of half bird, half, or in this case, an elf maiden, half woman. And he sends off a hunter to find this kinari, and he gets the kinari, this beautiful elf maiden, and she's brought into the enclosure of all these beings that are going to be sacrificed. And King Suchandrama invites all his fellow other kings and princes to the sacrifice so that they can benefit from it. And among these is Subahu. And Prince Subahu is, in the future, will become the Buddha. He is the Bodhisattva. And Subahu sees the kinari. And the kinari is just stunningly beautiful. I mean, imagine an elf maiden, so beautiful. And he falls in love with the elf maiden. He falls passionately, immediately in love with her. And the elf maiden, seeing him, falls in love with him. So what does he do? He doesn't say, spare the elf maiden, king. He says, why are you doing this? Why have you gathered all of these beings for the sacrifice? And the king says, well, if we sacrifice these, I will gain merit, I will go to heaven. This is the highest way of following religion. Dharma is the word. And King Subahu, the Prince Subahu, who's going to be the Buddha in the future life, says, no. This is the highest form of adharma, irreligion. To harm living beings, to kill living beings, is the worst possible thing that you can do. The highest thing that you can do to follow Dharma is to practice non-harm, to practice loving kindness. And he gives such an impressive discourse that the king lets all these creatures go, and well, they all live happily ever after. Subahu goes off with the elf maiden. There's a whole other story to do with him and the elf maiden and all the rest of it. But what is really interesting about this story, there's no mention of, there's no Buddhism here in a sense, not in a sort of sectarian sense. It's saying this is the worst thing you can do. To take the life of another, and certainly to justify it as religion, is the worst thing you can do. The highest thing you could do, the paramam dharma, as it's called, the perfect religious practice, the perfect dharma practice, is to practice non-harm, to practice loving kindness. Sometimes we're told that practicing metta, practicing loving kindness, we do it so we remove hatred so that we can gain enlightenment. But that's actually very superficial, actually, funnily enough. It's very superficial. Enlightenment is actually incidental. We practice loving kindness to benefit others. We practice loving kindness so that they benefit. That's why we do it. And this notion of practicing loving kindness for others runs very, very deep, actually, in social life, or should do. And it's perhaps one of the reasons why we have so many problems, is because it's not really recognised as being so central, so important. I mean, clearly, in not just the Buddhist tradition, but many, many traditions, there's this notion of what they call the golden rule. I think this is Aristotle's term. The golden rule. Do unto others as you do unto yourself. In the Christian tradition, you have love thy neighbour as thyself. And in the Buddhist tradition, you have very, very similar ideas. Cherish others as you cherish yourself. Some of you might have come across the idea that in Buddhism there's this teaching of anatman, not self. But you have to be very careful with that teaching. You have to sort of have a self before you can not have a self, if you see what I mean. Don't misunderstand that teaching. Buddhist tradition is very, very clear. First of all, you need to recognise very, very fully your self-cherishing. We are extraordinarily important to ourselves. I know a lot of people have trouble with their sort of self-view, self-image, liking themselves. I understand. It's not ever been an issue for me, I think, being such a rampant egotist, but I never have trouble in the first stage of the Metta Bhavana. It's the rest that's difficult. But we do really, however we go about it, we are incredibly important to ourselves. We couldn't really live without that. And it's very important to recognise that and develop it. Actually develop it. Really ask ourselves, well, what is the best way I can cherish this sense of myself? You know, I don't know about you, but I want to care for myself, protect myself, look after myself. I do things that serve that. There's a whole chapter in one of the Buddhist texts called, in the Dhammapada, on the self. The Buddha talks about the self. And he says, if you're going to really look after yourself, well, you stay up half the night meditating, or most of the night meditating. That's a bit much, isn't it? But I think what he's saying is, what he's saying in that verse, it's the principle of the thing. If you're going to really care for yourself, live meaningfully. Find out what is really important to really cherish yourself. Don't be just led along by other people's ideas of what's good for you. Don't just get shunted down the tram tracks of life. You know, and then I think that's where a lot of people have trouble, because they're not really doing what they want to do, deeply. You know, we often, fortunately, I've managed to always do what I've wanted to do. I'm very, very fortunate. But we can often feel pressed and pressured, so that we lose that sense of, well, what is my purpose? What is most meaningful? What do I do to really cherish myself and develop myself in the fullest way? If you're going to have love for yourself in that first stage of the practice, you have to really look at that, you know, really have to find what is meaningful for you. You know, how can you flourish? How can you be really enriched? And when you contact that, you then need to recognise, this is what you're doing in the other stages of the Metta Bhavana, is that actually everybody else are very important to themselves. In the same way that you're important to yourself, they are extraordinarily important to themselves. You know, they, like you, want to be treated well. They want to feel safe, they want to feel secure, they want to feel protected, they want to feel okay. They want to feel that their life is flourishing and unfolding. They want to be treated with courtesy and respect. This is absolutely fundamental to life. You know, if we're going to have a really, you know, a unified society, a unified world, certainly a unified spiritual community, we need to be practicing like this. We need to take the golden rule really seriously. We need to learn to imaginatively identify with others. When Subahu says, this is the highest rule of Dharma, the highest rule of religion, this is what he's talking about. This positive comparison with others, in the sense of seeing that we're fundamentally the same. There's a fundamental solidarity between us and others. And of course, that's what we're doing in the Metta practice. We're realising that more and more deeply, more and more profoundly, on deeper and deeper levels, and not just in relation to human beings, but in relation to animals, in relation to the whole of life itself, to everything in life. That sense of, well, it's more than connection, that sense of, it's deep solidarity, that realisation that fundamentally, although we're all very, very different, utterly unique, wonderfully, you know, pricelessly unique, we're fundamentally the same. The great Shantideva, one of the great Indian teachers who wrote a text that's very important to us in our movement, in his section on meditation, in his great work, the Bodhisattva, says that the practice that you need to engage in if you are to really make progress is what's known as the Paratma Samatha, that realising the sameness of self and other through this, in a sense, very simple meditation, of sort of experiencing another as yourself, experiences yourself as another, by getting down to that basic kind of sense of, what our basic motivations are. We want to avoid suffering. We want to be happy. And when we practice like this, it means that the world around us, other people around us, come alive. Come alive. We're less focused, if you like, entirely on our own sense of being alive. It's actually, in a way, life becomes sort of indivisible. You have a sense of the living beingness, the living being quality of everything around you. So this is absolutely fundamental, a fundamental basis, for Buddhist practice. I mentioned living in India. I mentioned Dr. Ambedkar. And Dr. Ambedkar, although he didn't live long as a Buddhist, he had a huge impact on the course of Buddhism. Because thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of his followers became Buddhist. And he was a great student of Buddhism. And he wrote a book called The Buddha and His Dhamma, which unfortunately he didn't finish. He was still working on it. It was by his bedside when he died. But there's a very deep section, very simple section, but very profound section in The Buddha and His Dhamma. And he asked the question, posits the question, what is the equivalent of God in Buddhism? Unusual question, because Buddhism is profoundly non-theistic. There's no creator God. There's no formless God in Buddhism. Buddhism doesn't have any limits in that sense. What replaces God in Buddhism? The question he was really asking, what is really sacred? What is holy, if you like, in Buddhism? What has, in a sense, authority in the positive sense? What is it that you don't ever transgress? And he says that is Dhamma. Dhamma. Dhamma is the equivalent of God in Buddhism. Dhamma here, not just the Buddha's teaching, not just the practices that we do, but the way things are. But then he went further. He said, well then, what is Dhamma? And he came up with this quite famous phrase, which is often quoted. Dhamma is nothing other than morality or ethics. Dhamma is morality, morality is Dhamma. It's a kind of phrase that you hear in the Buddhist world. Now that might sound, morality, I don't like the sound of that, that's rules and regulations. Then he asks the question, what is meant by morality here? What is the fundamental ethic in Buddhism? This is the fundamental ethic, the fundamental rule, if you like, is that we treat everybody with respect, even with reverence. We treat absolutely everybody in a manner that will give them dignity, will give them full dignity as human beings. And then he went into a whole discussion, is this true of other religions? And he said no, he thought that in other traditions, morality in this sense is detachable. Like you can detach a cart from a horse, because if God decides that actually this person is not worthy of being treated with reverence and dignity and respect, it's okay to make them a non-person, even to harm them, as we do, and we do know that this happens. He says in Buddhism there's no such thing. This is the way things are. You cannot transgress this basic ethic of treating all others with reverence and respect. And he went a bit further. He said, this is sacred and universal. Sacred and universal. Sacred, holy. More sacred than going on pilgrimage. Of course, he's speaking to an Indian audience, and in India, going on pilgrimage to Hindu holy sites and to get the blessings, the ashirwad of the god or whatever it is, extremely important. Dr. Ambedkar is saying, no. Actually, the most holy thing you can do is to treat others in this way. To treat others with reverence and respect. To treat all people, all beings like that. And it's universal. It's for all occasions, for all circumstances. There's no exemption. And you have to remember, this is a man who had to face down violence. This is a man talking within the context of, who lived through all of the violence of pre-independence India, who lived through seeing his own followers, killed, through their own sort of demonstration. And for a man like this to say this is extremely powerful to me. So the upshot of this really is that if we really want to practice the Dharma, practice Buddhism thoroughly, deeply, then we have to practice this reverence to everybody. Reverence for all life. William Blake, bringing it back to one of our own cultural heroes, says, "For everything that lives is holy." Everything that lives is holy. And it's amazing. And Shantideva, who I've also quoted, says, giving to others is greater than the worship of all the Buddhas. Now, this was a man who regarded worship of the Buddhas as the most wonderful thing to do, one of the most holy things to do. And he's saying, no, actually, serving your fellow man, your fellow woman, your fellow beings is actually superior to that. So when we're doing the Metta Bhavana, in our little way, just extending that friendly feeling more and more widely, we're moving in the direction of the way things are. It might seem slow, but if we come together to do this, don't just do it on our own, but we come together as a community, powerful things happen. Powerful forces are sort of unleashed when you get a community practicing like this, practicing with one another like this, and widening out to the wider community. I was talking to, I forget her name, Laura and Victoria earlier, and we were just talking about this. It's a sort of slow process, the transformation through Dharma practice, through Buddhist practice. But I was saying, well, look at this. I don't know how many years ago it was, but a few people came to Sheffield and started to do things, started to practice the Dharma together, share Buddhist practice with other people, practicing the Metta Bhavana, living the Metta Bhavana, acting with loving kindness to one another. And over time, something really incredible was created. A really positive environment for people to come into. And we need positive environments. It's very, very hard to sustain a practice of loving kindness, out in the world. I'm looking around, I'm sure many of you are working, in very challenging jobs and so on and so forth, and, in the city. And it's very, very hard to sustain that loving kindness. Sometimes you might be up against, objectively, as it were, quite difficult people. So it's very important to come into environments where you can relax, where it's easy. Sometimes people complain, oh, you Buddhists, you're hothouse flowers, you just live in your Buddhist environments, and, I'm going to do it in the world, and, kind of rugged, kind of macho Buddhism. But of course they go under. They sink because our practice is conditional. We're not Buddhas. We're not enlightened. We're not advanced bodhisattvas. We need environments to come into where we can feel ourselves flourishing and growing, because we're with people who are extending loving kindness towards us. Because this loving kindness I'm talking about, the Buddha's quality of loving kindness, it's not just making us feel good. It's sometimes said that this loving kindness has the quality that brings about our flourishing. This metaphor that the Buddha uses in a very famous metaphor, that we need to have a love for everybody like a mother's love for her only child. That is an incredibly powerful statement. He's not saying that a mother's love for her only child is metta. He's saying we need to feel that kind of quality of attention, that protecting and nurturing loving kindness to absolutely everybody. That kind of closeness, that kind of solidarity. It's an extraordinary thing to do. I mean, just imagine that recently in meditation I've been trying to imagine what that's like, just trying to imagine what the Buddha is really talking about there. But that's the kind of quality that we need to have kind of going on. It's creating a loving kindness where we feel our consciousness expanding when we're around it, when we're on the end of it. And others feel it when they're in our presence as well. That it's bringing about transformation, it's bringing about change. It's not just, keeping a kind of status quo going. It's kind of bringing about the growth, the transformation of the individual and the community. So we need environments like this to come into in order to support what we're doing, in order to come together so that we can do something greater, even greater than this. And it's a wonderful thing, this world of ours. It's a really, really wonderful thing. I had a really good experience of metta today. I think I can genuinely call it metta. I went to the Millennium Galleries and I heard Chris Watson's sound map of Sheffield. Have any of you been to this? It is absolutely fantastic. I mean, Chris Watson is a really good sound artist. But there you are. You go. I went in there, and it was the Sheffield Wednesday supporters, and all this sort of Wednesday, and all that. But he'd kind of treated it as well. He'd done something to it, morphing into the sound of these great sort of industrial clanking noises, which he'd turned into a kind of rhythm, which morphed into birdsong, owl hootings, and bells ringing, and then suddenly there was Vidanya chanting and Kate chanting. Bodhinaga had sent him a recording from the Buddhist Centre. So in the midst of all this stuff, suddenly there's the Dharma. It's absolutely beautiful. And then moving on again into birdsong and bells and sirens and Bramall Lane. You had to have Bramall Lane in as well as Hillsborough, of course. But there was something really lovely about it, not simply because there was the Dharma present, and knowing the centre, that was strongly evoked in the midst of all this. There's something about the whole realisation of it, of the beauty of all these sounds, the beauty of human life. I really got the sense of an artist at work. It weren't just sounds, there's something empathic happened to me, I suppose. Thinking of all the people involved, all the beings, not just people, involved in these noises, in these sounds. It just sort of evoked, a much deeper kind of sympathy. And the fact that there was some Buddhism in it as well was very, very inspiring. It gave me such a sort of positive vision, if you like, of Sheffield, of this city in this countryside, in this place, in this time. This is the way we're practicing. This is where we're doing the Metta Bhavana. This is where it's happening. It's not happening anywhere else. And we can go further forward with this practice. So come along on Saturday and we'll get down to the more nuts and bolts of the Metta Bhavana. But I think that's enough for now.